Well, let's consider for a moment the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, the trial where Jesus was condemned to death. I mean, what was the tipping point? What did Jesus say that caused the hammer of injustice to come crashing down on him? What were the words that caused the guilty verdict to cross the line? Well, it was all about Jesus referencing the Son of Man in Daniel 7 and claiming to be that Son of Man. And we see this clearly, just read, but I'll read it again because they're such powerful words. Mark chapter 14, verse 61. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." And it was only then that the high priest cried out, "Blasphemy." It was only then that the majority of the Sanhedrin issued the guilty verdict. It was because Jesus claimed the title of the Son of Man. So we're going to explore that and go in detail and see how much it impacted Jesus and his ministry. And so to do that, we'll go back to Daniel and we'll review what Daniel says about the Son of Man in chapter 7. Then we'll look at the Son of Man and the Son of Man's divinity, how Jesus saw that. Then the Son of Man's suffering, how Jesus saw the Son of Man was to suffer. And then we'll see how the Son of Man was to rule and to reign. How did Jesus see that? So those four things. First of all, the Son of Man in Daniel. What does the book of Daniel actually say? Well, the only references to the Son of Man in the book of Daniel are found in chapter 7. And the context is that vision of four beasts that come one after the other. And each of those beasts represents an empire. And while the fourth beast is raging against God's people in Daniel's vision, he is taken to a royal courtroom. A royal throne is placed, and the the Ancient of Days, the King of Kings, takes his seat. And before the King of Kings, there are thousands upon thousands attendants, and there are 10,000 times 10,000, the book of Daniel says, that are there as the books of judgment are opened. And that's the context which we read about the Son of Man. And read this from verse 13. "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." And we see a couple of things here with this. Three things, in fact. We're seeing, first of all, that the Son of Man is given authority over all the nations. Second thing we're told in that passage is the Son of Man, all of the nations will worship him. And the third thing we're told is that the kingdom that the Son of Man will reign over will never end. So authority over all the nations, he will be worshipped, and his kingdom will never end. And in many respects, that's pretty much it in Daniel. In verse 22, a few verses on, it talks about the Son of Man confronting and conquering the fourth beast. But apart from that, those are the references to Daniel about the Son of Man. Now, before we see how this impacts Jesus, we need to consider a contemporary of Daniel, and that's the prophet Ezekiel. Now, Ezekiel was a priest during the exile, and he was taken, probably at the same time as Daniel, back to Babylon. And there, Ezekiel the priest was given a whole lot of visions, of prophecies. And in the book of Ezekiel, God refers to the prophet 90 times as the Son of Man. 90 times Ezekiel is called the Son of Man. I won't read all 90 examples. We'd be here for a long time. But Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 1. "Then God said to me, Son of man, stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you." Now, it seems that the use of this title by God to Ezekiel, basically most of the times when God gave Ezekiel a prophet or a vision, he would say, "Son of man, what do you see?" Or, "Son of man, take these words and speak to the people." It seems that God was using this title as almost a cryptic indirect reference to the prophet. Now, this prophet had much to say about Jerusalem's destruction and the coming of the kingdom. And so both Daniel and Ezekiel's use of the Son of Man we need to consider by Jesus as he takes these up. You see, the Son of Man, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man 80 times in the Gospel. 80 times he says the Son of Man is this, or the Son of Man does this. No one else calls Jesus the Son of Man. No one asks him, are you the Son of Man? It's a self-title. Now, with this self-title of the Son of Man, Jesus picks up both Daniel and Ezekiel's use of that title in a very clever way. You see, when he talks about the Son of Man, most of the other people thought, who were listening, most of the listeners thought he was referring to the Son of Man like Ezekiel, just a prophet. Jesus is using the title the Son of Man to refer to himself like Ezekiel did. No big deal. However, when Jesus used the title the Son of Man, he was referring to himself to the Son of Man of Daniel, who would come in his glory. And this gave him the advantage of being able to describe the Messiah in the third person. You see, the Messiah who was to come, that's another name for the Son of Man, the Messiah to come was to come in all glory. But by referring to the Son of Man as indirectly, he wasn't boasting or bragging. He could be truthful about the Messiah and what the Messiah would be doing, but he did that and crouched that in terms of the Son of Man. So the Son of Man will come in glory. He didn't say, I will come in glory as Messiah. He would say the Son of Man would come in glory. And so because it was an undefined term and there was a little bit of confusion in the mind of the listeners, Jesus was able to use this title to build on it in some very clever and astounding ways. So when he used the title Son of Man, most people thought, oh, it's just like Ezekiel, but he meant the Daniel use. You'll understand, I think, a bit better as we go through some examples. So let's see the Son of Man and divinity. What does this mean? Well, one day Jesus was teaching in a house in his hometown of Capernaum. And because of the crowds, people couldn't get in, and there were 4 men who came with a stretcher, and on the stretcher was a friend of theirs, a paralytic. And they couldn't get through the crowd into the house to have this man prayed for. So they went up on the stairs on the outside of the house, and in Palestine in those days, the roof was flat and was used in a similar way that we would use a deck. And so they climbed up on the outside stairs, and they made a hole on the roof, and they lowered Jesus down. And Jesus, when he saw their faith, was impressed. And we picked this up in Mark chapter 2, verse 5, where he says, when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, Son, your sins are forgiven. Now some teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, why does this fellow talk like this? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Now in this, the religious leaders were 100% correct. Only God has the authority to forgive sins, and only him alone. And then notice what Jesus does now. He goes on to say this. Why are you thinking these things? Which is it easier to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and take your mat and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, I'll tell you, get up, take your mat and go home. He got up, took his mat and walked out in full view of them all. Notice verse 10, but that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. What's Jesus doing here is he's claiming divinity. He's claiming the authority of God. And of course, because forgiveness is an internal sort of spiritual transaction, anyone could say to someone else, you're forgiven, and because there's nothing on the outside, you wouldn't know, would you? So Jesus connects forgiveness on the inside, spiritual forgiveness, with the physical healing. And because that paralytic was healed, demonstrated to everyone clearly that the Son of Man, Jesus, has authority to forgive. And so we see an aspect of Jesus' divinity. He associates the Son of Man with the divine and therefore is worthy to be worshipped. We see this just a few verses on in a second example. read this in verse 23 of 1 Peter. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus then goes on to give them an Old Testament exception, and then he says this, "So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath." Now let's think about this for a minute. Sabbath keeping is one of the 10 commandments, the central commandments of both the Jewish and the Christian faith. The 10 commandments were instituted by God, and Jesus is claiming to have authority even over the 10 commandments. What he's doing here is claiming to be divine. Now, if he'd just got up and said, "I'm divine," they would have probably got stones and thrown them at him. But because he was using the title Son of Man, and it was just a little bit ambiguous, they were thinking, he means the prophet, because he was able to say all these amazing things about himself without appearing to be boastful. And of course, those that had ears to listen understood, where most people, it went over their heads. And so, Jesus uses the Son of Man, the title, to allow himself to assert all the wonderful things about the Messiah, including his divinity. Now, the second thing he does with the title is he allows that title, or associates that title with his suffering and then his resurrection. And we see this in a number of places, and we see this in particular in Mark's Gospel, but the other Gospels as well. And so we see this in chapter 8, verse 31. Now, the context is Jesus has just asked his disciples who they think Jesus is, and the disciples have correctly said, or Peter has said on behalf of the disciples, "You are the Messiah." Now, straight after that, Jesus says these words from chapter 8, verse 31. "Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the 3 days rise again." He spoke plainly about this. And you may remember the story that Peter starts to rebuke Jesus for saying these things, and what does Jesus say to Peter? Do you remember? "Get behind me, Satan." But the point here is that Jesus makes it very clear that the Son of Man must suffer. And even though it upset Peter, it's not the point. Now, he's on the way to Jerusalem, and a total of 3 times here, and 2 other times he repeats this, and we see this in chapter 9, verse 31. "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." And a little bit further on in chapter 10, we see this in verse 33. "We are going up to Jerusalem," Jesus said, "and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. 3 days later he will rise." So there's this emphasis on the Son of Man suffering. Now here's the thing, we need to pause for a moment and consider this. Nowhere in Daniel chapter 7 is there any reference to the Son of Man suffering. And this is one of the things that threw the Jewish religious leaders, is because they knew Daniel 7, and here Jesus is saying the Son of Man must suffer, and they're saying, well, it's nowhere in Daniel 7. What Jesus is doing there is picking up the prophecies of the suffering servant in Isaiah. Now in Isaiah there are, especially around chapters 52 and 53, it's very clear that the Messiah will suffer. And Jesus is picking up these prophecies and incorporating in the Son of Man. However, the Jewish people then and today don't believe the suffering servant has anything to do with the Messiah. So from the Jewish point of view in the past and today, they don't believe the Messiah will suffer, he will just come in glory. But Jesus is saying, no, those suffering servant prophecies are part of me being the Son of Man. Jesus is allowed to modestly assert his divinity, but also associate his mission in terms of suffering. And we think, well, why does he have to suffer? Well, again, a couple of verses later, he tells us why the Son of Man must suffer. Chapter 10, verse 45, "Even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom of many." So the Son of Man, here he is divine and wonderful, able to forgive and has authority over all the law of God, and yet he chooses to give his life as a ransom for you and I. The Son of Man must suffer. We were captive to sin and death, but because Christ came and suffered and rose from the dead, we have been set free. So, the Son of God and his suffering. Finally, we come to Son of God and his reigning, his ruling and reigning. Now, this is very clear in Daniel 7, isn't it? That the Son of Man will come in clouds and take up his place before the Ancient of Days to rule and to reign. And Jesus saw him doing just this. However, he saw his coming in the clouds of glory, not in his first coming. No, he came firstly humbly in a manger, born in Bethlehem. No, he saw his coming in glory with his second coming, post the cross, post the resurrection, post his ascension. He saw himself coming again in glory. And that's what we see at his trial. See, up until that time, when he said, I'm the Son of Man, when I'm the Son of Man, people thought, Ezekiel, he's just like the prophet. But at his trial, when he claimed specifically Daniel 7, the religious leaders knew without a doubt that he was claiming the Daniel 7, the Son of Man. And again, we'll go through it again. Have a look at it again, Mark. Chapter 14, verse 62. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. And Jesus is claiming two things here. First, he is claiming that he will be at the right hand of God, the Ancient of Days, to rule and to reign. But he's also claiming that he will come again from the clouds of heaven, and that even those people that were at his trial will see him coming in the clouds. Well, let's see how this plays out in the rest of the Bible. Firstly, we'll have a look at Jesus sitting at the right hand of God. If we fast forward not too far, a few months to the early church, we think of Stephen. And Stephen was refuting those people in Jerusalem and arguing about Jesus. And anyone that argued that Jesus wasn't the Messiah, he was able to debate. This infuriated the people. So he was taken to trial before the Sanhedrin. He was before the same people that convicted Jesus. And he finishes his defense by waving his fingers. I can imagine Stephen saying, and you killed the Messiah, God's only Son. And then we pick this up in Acts chapter 7, what's happening there. Acts chapter 7. When they heard this is Stephen saying, you killed the Messiah. When they heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and saw Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see heaven opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Jesus had used exactly that same passage and it had got him killed. And here is Stephen quoting from Daniel 7. And their reaction at this, they covered their ears and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him. They dragged Stephen out of the city and began to stone him. Why? Because he maintained that Jesus was the Son of Man. Note to self, if you're ever on trial for your faith, be very brave if you want to quote Daniel 7. There's a bit of a precedent there. But the point is, they stoned Stephen because in their mind, Stephen crossed the line when he claimed that Jesus was the Son of Man from Daniel 7. But there's the second part of Jesus' claim at his trial, that he will return in clouds of glory, and not only those who desire to see the Messiah come in clouds of glory, but even those that pierced him. And so how do we see that playing out in the New Testament? Well, in Acts chapter 1, we see that over a 40-day period after Jesus' resurrection, he made a number of appearances to the disciples. On that last appearance, he is taken up to heaven, and we read this in chapter 1 of Acts. verse 9. After he said this, Jesus was taken up before their eyes, and a cloud hid them from their sight. Notice the reference to the cloud. While they were standing there, 2 angels appeared and said this, Men of Galilee, why do you stand there looking to the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way that you have seen him go into heaven. So again, we've got that reference of Jesus disappearing into the clouds. The angels say that Jesus will return in the same way with the clouds. Not only that, we see in Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. Look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. Remember, Jesus said, you will see me come in the clouds. The Sanhedrin in the book of Revelation says that Jesus, when he returns in the clouds, even those who pierced Jesus will see him come. And then a final reference in Revelation as we sort of come to the end of the theme of the Son of Man. And in Revelation chapter 14, we read this. That's John the Apostle, I looked, and there before me was a white cloud. Seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And in verse 16, so he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. And if we go back to Daniel 7, we are told that before the Ancient of Days, all of the books of judgment were opened. And then the Son of Man was presented to the Ancient of Days with all authority over all the nations. And here in Revelation, we see that same image of the Son of Man on the clouds, ready to judge all people. And so you can see that theme of the Son of Man. Now we'll finish this sermon here. We'll tie up a few thoughts. You can see that whole title, the Son of Man, how Jesus took what Daniel said and what Ezekiel said and integrated them. The fact that Ezekiel was called the Son of Man 90 times meant that most of the people who heard Jesus use the title just assumed he was like Ezekiel and no different. But in Jesus' mind, he was the Son of Man, as in Daniel chapter 7. And some people got it. The disciples got it eventually. A lot of the women who followed Jesus, they got it. And then post-resurrection, of course, people understood with the coming of the Holy Spirit that Jesus was the Son of Man, that he was divine. And so Luke, the Gospel of Luke, finishes with the disciples in the temple worshipping Jesus because they understood he was the Son of Man. And from the Gospels, we're also seeing that he associated that title with suffering. That through the Jewish folk, because they just weren't expecting the Son of Man to suffer. But Jesus said, no, I must give my life as a ransom for many. And then, of course, we see him in visions yet to come, but the Bible describes he will come in his glory in the clouds, and he will judge all people of every language and every nation, and set up his eternal kingdom. And the good news of the gospel, all those who look to Jesus and call him Lord are adopted into that kingdom where there will be joy everlasting as we dwell in the presence of the Son of Man. Let's pray.